You're lying in bed. The world is finally quiet. The lights are off, the notifications have stopped, and there's nothing left to do. And yet your brain decides it's the perfect time to start a board meeting. One voice is replaying something you said 2 years ago. Another is planning out 10 different futures, and a third is asking questions you never had time to answer during the day. You aren't alone. In fact, this moment, this twilight between rest and wakefulness, is a sacred time for overthinkers. Overthinking isn't just a habit. It's a pattern of mental life, a way of existing that feels as though your mind is never truly still. Some people wear it like armor. Others experience it like a storm. But whatever shape it takes, it usually starts the same way, with a single thought. And that one thought doesn't know how to end. It multiplies, twists, and spirals until you're somewhere between clarity and chaos. You may call it analysis, or maybe reflection, but sometimes it feels more like noise than insight. Why do we do this? What purpose does it serve? And more importantly, is there an art to thinking too much? In this video, we'll explore the psychology of overthinking, not as a flaw to be fixed, but as a deeply human tendency that comes from the way our brains are wired, how our past has shaped us, and the subtle illusions of control that thought gives us. This won't be about quick hacks to shut your mind off. Instead, we'll walk through the architecture of your inner world. What happens in your brain when thoughts loop endlessly, why certain people are more prone to overthinking than others, and how our emotions, habits, and beliefs become tangled in the threads of constant mental chatter. But we won't stop there. We'll look at the difference between overthinking and genuine reflection, where the line lies between useful mental processing and paralyzing thought. We'll unpack the types of overthinkers, the traps of cognitive biases, and the hidden reasons we hold onto our thoughts even when they hurt us. Most importantly, we'll explore ways to coexist with a mind that never stops moving, because sometimes the goal isn't to silence your thoughts, it's to understand them well enough that they lose their power to control you. So if you've ever felt like your mind is both your greatest tool and your biggest burden, stay with me. This is the beginning of a journey through your own psychology. Welcome to the art of thinking too much. Overthinking isn't just a tendency to think a lot. It's a particular way of thinking, circular, sticky, and emotionally charged. At its core, overthinking is the act of dwelling on a thought or series of thoughts in a way that is repetitive and unproductive. It's not just about how much you think, but about the quality and direction of your thoughts. In many cases, it feels like you're solving something, replaying an event, preparing for a conversation, or examining every angle of a decision. But what's really happening is different. You're looping. You're circling back to the same point, again and again, without moving forward. Psychologists often describe overthinking using two main categories: rumination and worry. Rumination is typically about the past. You might replay a mistake, reanalyze a decision, or imagine how things could have gone differently. Worry, on the other hand, focuses on the future. It's a mental attempt to control uncertainty, to predict outcomes, to avoid pain by preparing for every possible scenario. While they seem like opposites, past versus future, they share the same underlying function: the illusion of control. By turning something over and over in your mind, you feel like you're doing something, when in reality you're standing still. The line between healthy reflection and overthinking is thin but important. Reflection can be grounding. It helps you learn, grow, and gain insight. It's structured, purposeful, and has an end point. Overthinking, by contrast, rarely resolves anything. It thrives on uncertainty, on not knowing, and so it keeps going, not to find clarity, but to stay afloat in the discomfort of ambiguity. It's thinking that refuses to land. For many people, overthinking begins as a coping mechanism, a form of hypervigilance. If you grew up in an environment where mistakes were punished or unpredictability was dangerous, then thinking more, rehearsing more, planning more might have felt like safety. Over time, that protective instinct becomes chronic. The brain begins to equate thinking with being safe. You don't even notice it happening. It becomes second nature. By the time adulthood arrives, overthinking isn't something you do, it's who you are. But this constant inner dialogue has a cost. Overthinking increases stress and anxiety. It disrupts sleep, impairs decision-making, and weakens memory. It pulls you out of the present moment and locks you in a mental maze. What's worse, it often disguises itself as intelligence. You might be praised for being thoughtful or careful, but deep down you feel trapped, because while others see insight, you feel exhaustion. It's worth noting, too, that overthinking doesn't always sound like thoughts. Sometimes it feels like a sensation, a tightness in your chest, a spinning in your stomach, or a sense that something just isn't right. These are the physical manifestations of mental unrest. Your body reacts as if there's an immediate problem to solve, even when the only thing happening is a loop inside your head. That's why telling yourself to just stop thinking never works. The problem isn't just mental, it's embodied. It lives in your nervous system. And yet, for all its challenges, overthinking also reflects something beautiful, a mind that cares, a mind that wants to get things right, a mind that's searching for meaning, understanding, and peace. The trouble is that it's using a tool, endless thought, to chase something that can't always be solved with logic alone. And when the mind can't solve it, it spirals deeper, convinced that just one more thought will make the difference. But here's where the paradox lies. The more we try to outthink our way out of discomfort, the more discomfort we create. The very effort to avoid emotional pain by analyzing it becomes the thing that feeds it. That's the trap of overthinking. It promises safety, but delivers entanglement. Now that we've defined what overthinking is and how it operates, we can go deeper into the question, why does the mind do this? To answer that, we need to explore the architecture of our inner world, not just from a psychological standpoint, but from a biological one. Because long before we had names for overthinking, our brains were already wired to do it. To truly understand overthinking, we have to explore what's happening inside the brain. This isn't just a matter of behavior or personality. It's biology, chemistry, and ancient neural circuitry at work. The modern world may have given us more to think about, but the machinery of thought itself is old, automatic, and deeply rooted in survival. At the heart of overthinking lies a part of the brain known as the default mode network, or DMN. This network is active when the brain is at rest, when you're not engaged in any specific task, and your mind begins to wander. It's the home of daydreams, memories, imagination, and internal dialogue. The DMN connects several brain regions, including the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex, areas involved in self-referential thinking, time-traveling through memories, and envisioning the future. When you're lost in thought, replaying an awkward conversation, or projecting into 1,000 possible futures, the DMN is likely in full swing. It's not inherently bad. In fact, this network is essential for creativity, problem-solving, and planning. But in people who overthink, this system is often hyperactive. The DMN becomes a kind of mental echo chamber, feeding thoughts back into themselves without resolution. Overthinking also involves the prefrontal cortex, the command center of the brain responsible for logic, decision-making, and control. While this region is often praised for its role in critical thinking, it can become over-involved when uncertainty arises. The prefrontal cortex tries to manage that uncertainty by running simulations, projecting various outcomes, running what-if scenarios, checking for danger. It believes that if it can anticipate every possible threat, it can avoid pain. But in doing so, it inadvertently creates anxiety. Supporting this process is the amygdala, the brain's emotional alarm system. The amygdala scans for threats and triggers emotional responses, especially fear. When it perceives something as potentially dangerous, it sends signals to activate the stress response. This can be helpful in situations where quick action is needed, but the amygdala doesn't distinguish between a physical threat and an imagined one. To it, an upcoming conversation or uncertain decision can feel like a lion in the room. And when paired with a hyperactive DMN, and an over-engaged prefrontal cortex, the result is a loop of thinking, feeling, and fearing that's hard to break. Biochemically, this loop is fueled by cortisol, the stress hormone. When the brain senses danger, real or imagined, it releases cortisol to keep the body alert. But chronic overthinking means chronic cortisol release, which can impair memory, reduce immune function, and disrupt sleep. Meanwhile, dopamine, the brain's reward chemical, occasionally joins the party. Every time you think you've figured something out, solved a mental puzzle, or anticipated a potential danger, dopamine gives you a tiny hit of satisfaction. This reinforcement makes overthinking feel rewarding, even if the overall experience is exhausting. From an evolutionary standpoint, this makes sense. Our ancestors who paid attention to subtle dangers, who rehearsed the day's events or imagined what might go wrong, were more likely to survive. The ability to mentally simulate outcomes was adaptive. It allowed humans to prepare, plan, and avoid threats before they happened. But in the modern world, where physical danger is less common and threats are more abstract, job interviews, relationship dynamics, existential questions, our brains still react the same way. They interpret uncertainty as danger and respond with overanalysis. This is why overthinking can feel so hard to escape. It's not just a mental habit, it's a survival response. The brain believes it's protecting you. It doesn't realize that the threat is conceptual, not physical, and it certainly doesn't know when to stop. Without a clear signal that the danger has passed, it keeps spinning, caught in a loop of thought, fear, and imagined control. Even attempts to quiet the mind can backfire. Telling yourself to stop thinking often leads to even more thinking, now focused on why you can't stop. This is sometimes called metacognition, thinking about thinking. And while it can lead to insight, it can also become its own feedback loop. But here's the good news. The same brain that overthinks is capable of incredible flexibility. Thanks to neuroplasticity, the brain can rewire itself through intention, awareness, and new experiences. While you can't shut down the DMN or deactivate the prefrontal cortex, you can train your attention, adjust your responses, and reshape the meaning you assign to your thoughts. Understanding the science doesn't magically solve the problem, but it gives us a powerful lens. It reminds us that overthinking isn't a personal weakness. It's an overextension of a strength. And by recognizing the systems at play, we can begin to change our relationship to them. Next, we'll move deeper into that relationship. If the brain is so invested in thought, what triggers it to obsess, replay, and spiral in the first place? To answer that, we have to look beyond biology and into the emotional and psychological roots of why we ruminate. Rumination doesn't appear out of nowhere. It has roots emotional, experiential, and often invisible to the conscious mind. While the brain's default mode network may be the engine, it's our life experiences and emotional patterns that lay the tracks. Understanding the psychological triggers behind overthinking means asking a more personal question. What is your mind trying to protect you from? For many, overthinking begins as an early survival strategy. Childhood is a time when we begin to make sense of the world and of ourselves through the reactions of those around us. If you grew up in an unpredictable environment, where emotions were volatile, love was conditional, or mistakes were met with punishment, then vigilance became necessary. Your mind learned that predicting others' reactions or endlessly reviewing your own behavior might keep you safe. In those cases, rumination is not weakness, it's resilience. It's the brain's best attempt at control in a world that once felt out of control. These early conditions often form what psychologists call schemas, core beliefs about yourself and the world that persist into adulthood. If your schema says, "I'm not good enough," then your mind will constantly search for evidence to confirm that belief. A conversation that didn't go smoothly, a delayed response from a friend, a critical look from a stranger, all of these become triggers for mental loops. The thinking isn't random. It's organized around a hidden emotional wound that hasn't fully healed. Other psychological factors also play a role. Perfectionism, for example, is a powerful driver of overthinking. When your self-worth is tied to flawless performance, every decision becomes high stakes. You review and revise not just to get it right, but to avoid the shame of getting it wrong. Even after an outcome is decided, your mind might continue to dissect the process, just in case you missed something, just in case you could do better next time. It feels like striving for excellence, but often it's fear in disguise. Fear, in fact, is the common thread through most rumination. The fear of regret, the fear of failure, the fear of being judged, misunderstood, or unloved. Sometimes it's not even fear of a specific outcome, but fear of not knowing. The uncertainty itself becomes intolerable, so we try to solve it with thought. We chase clarity. We dig for closure. But some situations don't have perfect answers, and the mind doesn't like that. So it loops. Attachment theory also sheds light on this behavior. People with anxious attachment styles, often developed in childhood, tend to overanalyze social interactions, relationships, and emotional cues. If love once felt unpredictable, then overthinking becomes a way to monitor and anticipate shifts in connection. Did they mean what they said? Are they upset? Did I do something wrong? These are not idle curiosities. They are attempts to soothe relational anxiety through mental investigation. But rather than soothing, the process often escalates the distress. Even trauma plays a critical role in ruminative patterns. When the body experiences trauma, especially emotional or psychological trauma, it becomes more sensitive to perceived threats. The nervous system stays on alert. The mind, in turn, tries to process the overwhelming event not once but many times, as if repetition could make sense of what felt senseless. This form of rumination isn't just obsessive, it's a replay of pain that never found a safe place to land. But not all rumination comes from wounds. Sometimes it stems from identity. If you've built your self-concept around being the thinker, the planner, the one who figures things out, then quieting the mind might feel like a betrayal. For you, thinking is purpose. It's how you feel useful, competent, even worthy. In those cases, overthinking is not about anxiety, it's about self-preservation. To stop would be to question who you are. Still, regardless of origin, the result is the same. A mind that doesn't know how to rest. And that restlessness is often invisible to others. On the outside, you may appear calm, even composed, but inside the wheels are turning fast. You're reanalyzing what you said in that meeting. You're preparing for a conversation that hasn't happened yet. You're wondering if you offended someone, missed a sign, made the right choice. No one sees it, but it's constant. Recognizing these psychological roots doesn't fix the problem overnight, but it creates space to stop blaming yourself for thinking too much and instead begin asking why your mind feels the need to think so hard. Often beneath the rumination is a younger part of you still trying to feel safe, still trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense at the time. So as we move forward, we'll shift from why overthinking begins to how it shows up in different people. Because while the pattern may be common, the expression of it is uniquely personal. Let's explore the different kinds of overthinkers and how they experience the world through the lens of their own mental loops. Overthinking wears many faces. It's not a one-size-fits-all experience, and it doesn't sound the same inside every mind. Some people overthink with emotion, others with logic. Some are stuck in the past, others in the future. What binds them together is the restless loop, the sense that thought keeps returning to a central knot that refuses to loosen. But the flavor of that loop, the way it's felt and expressed, varies deeply from person to person. One common form is the analyst. This type treats every situation like a puzzle to be solved. When something doesn't make sense, especially if it involves emotions or other people's behavior, they break it down into tiny pieces, trying to understand the mechanics. They dissect every word, every gesture, every nuance of tone. It's not about gossip or judgment. It's about decoding the unspoken. These overthinkers often excel in systems thinking or strategy, but inside their own lives, This mindset can backfire. Not everything emotional can be solved with logic. Not every moment needs a blueprint. Then there's the historian, the person who replays the past like an endless film reel. They go over conversations that already happened, things they said, things they didn't say, how others might have perceived them. Regret and self-doubt are common companions. The historian lives with the belief that if they just think hard enough, they can rewrite the past, or at least extract a lesson that might justify it. But the lesson never quite satisfies, because the truth they're often avoiding is this: the past can't be undone. No amount of rumination will make it disappear. Next is the futurist, whose mind lives in the world of what-ifs. They overanalyze the future with such intensity that the present becomes irrelevant. Every decision is the beginning of a complex tree of possibilities. What if this happens? What if it doesn't? What if I regret this later? The futurist believes that preparation equals safety. But instead of preparing, they often end up paralyzed, unable to choose, unable to move, afraid of making the wrong choice. This type may look outwardly responsible or cautious, but inwardly, they're caught in a whirlwind of imagined catastrophes. There's also the emotional empath, someone whose overthinking is deeply tied to relationships and emotional tone. They're constantly wondering how others feel, if they've upset anyone or if they're being perceived the wrong way. These overthinkers can sense emotional shifts in others, but often misread them through the filter of self-doubt. They carry conversations with them long after they've ended, looping over the subtext and tone. Their greatest fear is disconnection or rejection, so their thoughts work overtime to preserve connection, even if it means inventing problems that were never there. Another type is the fixer. This person is compelled to solve problems, even ones that aren't theirs. They carry the emotional weight of others, often inserting themselves into situations where their help wasn't asked for. Their overthinking is a constant scan for what's broken, what's out of place, and how to make it right. On the surface, they seem helpful, generous, even heroic. But inside, this compulsion can be exhausting. Not every situation needs to be fixed. Not every burden is theirs to carry. Yet their minds refuse to rest unless everything feels resolved. And finally, we have the philosopher, whose overthinking is existential. They don't worry about conversations or logistics. They think about meaning, purpose, identity, mortality. Their loops are not about the next task. They're about the nature of reality itself. They might lie awake wondering if their life has meaning, if the universe has order, or what their role in the grand scheme of things is. These thoughts aren't necessarily anxious. They can be poetic, curious, even beautiful. But left unchecked, they can become consuming, making ordinary life feel unreal or disconnected. Of course, most people are a blend of these types. You might see yourself in the analyst one day, and in the empath the next. These categories aren't boxes, they're windows, and they exist not to label you, but to help you recognize patterns. Because when you can name the shape your overthinking takes, you gain distance from it. You stop believing that it's just who you are, and start seeing it as a response, one that had a purpose, even if it no longer serves you. Now that we've identified the different ways overthinking manifests, let's turn our focus to what drives and sustains these patterns under the surface. It's not just memory or imagination, it's the subtle influence of cognitive biases. These mental shortcuts are often invisible, but they play a powerful role in keeping the loop alive. If overthinking is a maze, then cognitive biases are the invisible walls that keep us turning in circles. These biases are mental shortcuts, rules of thumb the brain uses to make decisions quickly. They're helpful in many cases. After all, our brains have to process an overwhelming amount of information every day. But when it comes to complex emotional or uncertain situations, these shortcuts can become traps. They distort our judgment, reinforce our fears, and quietly convince us that our thoughts are more accurate than they really are. One of the most powerful biases involved in overthinking is catastrophizing. This bias tricks us into believing that the worst-case scenario is not only possible, but probable. A simple delay in someone's response becomes a sign that they're angry or leaving. A minor mistake at work spirals into fears of being fired or humiliated. The mind fixates on the worst outcome and then begins rehearsing it in vivid detail. The purpose, it believes, is preparation, but in truth, it's magnifying fear and amplifying stress without providing any real solution. Another common trap is confirmation bias, the tendency to seek out or interpret information in a way that confirms what we already believe. If you're convinced you're not good enough, your mind will scan for proof. It will remember the one piece of negative feedback and ignore the 10 compliments. It will misinterpret a neutral look from someone as judgment. Overthinking feeds on confirmation bias because the more you think, the more evidence you gather. But it's not objective evidence. It's filtered through the lens of belief, and often that belief is rooted in insecurity. There's also mind reading, a form of cognitive distortion where you assume you know what others are thinking, usually something negative. You convince yourself that someone's silence means disapproval, or that their expression hides disappointment. The truth is you don't know, but the mind fills in the gaps, and once a theory forms, it becomes hard to dislodge. You start acting based on your assumption, which further feeds the overthinking cycle. Then comes black and white thinking, also known as all or nothing thinking. This bias turns every experience into an extreme. If you're not perfect, you're a failure. If someone didn't respond warmly, they must dislike you. There's no room for nuance, no space for gray areas. This kind of thinking puts enormous pressure on every action and decision, making it feel like the stakes are always high. And when the stakes feel high, the mind goes into overdrive, trying to avoid the imagined consequence of falling short. Another subtle bias is the negativity bias, which causes us to give more weight to negative experiences than positive ones. This is an evolutionary trait. Our ancestors survived by remembering danger. But in modern life, it creates an imbalance. A minor insult can echo in your head for days, while a compliment fades within minutes. Overthinking latches onto negativity because it feels more urgent, more real. It becomes a magnet for attention, pulling your thoughts into the familiar spiral of what went wrong, what could go wrong, and why it's probably your fault. Even the illusion of control plays a role here. This is the belief that if you think about something enough, you can prevent it from happening. It gives a false sense of mastery over the future. Your mind keeps spinning, believing that it's helping, that it's responsible for protecting you. But control is often an illusion, especially when the situation involves other people, uncertainty, or outcomes that simply aren't within your reach. The more the mind seeks control, the more it finds chaos, and so it thinks even harder, tightening the loop. What makes these biases so tricky is that they feel rational in the moment. They disguise themselves as logic, preparation, responsibility. But underneath, they are often driven by fear, insecurity, and unresolved emotion. They pull you deeper into the thought spiral without you even realizing that your reasoning is flawed. Becoming aware of these biases doesn't mean they vanish, but it gives you a new perspective, a way to pause and ask, is this true, or is this just a story my mind is telling me? That pause can change everything. It introduces doubt into the certainty of your inner narrator. It breaks the spell of inevitability. As we move forward, we'll explore something even more surprising. The idea that overthinking isn't always about fear. Sometimes it's about reward. There are hidden benefits, real or imagined, that keep the pattern alive. And to truly untangle the art of thinking too much, we need to understand what the mind thinks it's gaining from the process. It might seem counterintuitive to suggest that overthinking offers any kind of benefit. After all, most people who struggle with it describe it as exhausting, frustrating, and emotionally draining. But if a mental habit persists, especially one as consuming as overthinking, there's usually a reason. Beneath the fatigue and frustration, the mind believes it is gaining something valuable. In psychology, this is known as secondary gain, a hidden reward that reinforces the behavior, even when the surface cost is high. One of the most seductive rewards of overthinking is the illusion of control. When life feels uncertain, chaotic, or emotionally volatile, the mind searches for something to hold on to. Thinking becomes a lifeline. If you can analyze a situation from every angle, perhaps you can avoid being hurt. If you can predict how someone will react, maybe you can protect your feelings. Overthinking in this sense becomes a form of emotional armor. It creates the feeling that you are doing something, staying one step ahead, staying prepared, even if nothing has actually changed in the real world. There is also the belief that overthinking is a sign of intelligence or responsibility. Society often praises those who are deep thinkers, those who anticipate problems, who reflect before they act. And to some extent that's true. But the line between healthy introspection and mental overdrive is easy to cross. Overthinkers may cling to the habit because it makes them feel competent. They believe that to not think deeply about something would be lazy, reckless, or shallow. The irony is that the more pressure they put on their thoughts to solve everything, the more those thoughts begin to fray. For some, overthinking provides a sense of identity. It's part of how they define themselves. I'm just someone who thinks a lot. That statement might seem innocent, even self-aware, but it can also become a trap. If thinking is how you make sense of who you are, then giving it up, even partially, can feel like losing a part of yourself. You might fear that without all the analysis, planning, and rehearsing, you'd be someone else entirely. And that unknown self can feel scarier than the mental noise you've come to know. There's also a hidden form of avoidance embedded in overthinking. It might look like you're trying to solve a problem, but often, what you're really doing is avoiding a feeling. Thinking becomes a distraction from feeling vulnerable, uncertain, or emotionally exposed. Instead of admitting, I'm hurt or I'm afraid, the mind takes a detour. It spins out theories, prepares dialogues, replays scenes. It turns raw emotion into structured thought, because that feels safer, more controlled, less messy. Even procrastination can wear the disguise of overthinking. Sometimes, we don't want to make a decision because the stakes feel high or the outcome is uncertain. So instead of acting, we keep thinking. We tell ourselves we're being thorough. But what we're really doing is stalling. Overthinking gives us a reason to delay. It whispers that we're still working on it, that more thought will lead to a better answer. But often the answer doesn't come, because what's really needed is not more thought, but more courage. Some people also find a strange comfort in familiar discomfort. That is, overthinking becomes a companion. It's always there. Even though it causes stress, it's predictable. It fills the quiet moments, gives shape to uncertainty, and occupies mental space that might otherwise be left open to uncomfortable truths. Letting go of overthinking doesn't just mean thinking less. It means facing what you've been avoiding with all that mental noise. And that can be daunting. So yes, there are benefits to overthinking, but many of them are illusions. They feel like protection, but they often prolong the very discomfort they aim to prevent. They promise clarity, but they rarely deliver peace. And that's why overthinking is so persistent. It rewards us just enough to keep us hooked, while quietly eroding our well-being. But recognizing these false rewards is powerful. It allows us to question whether the mind's strategies are truly serving us. It opens a door to a different way of being, not one where we silence our thoughts completely, but one where we see them clearly, understand their purpose, and begin to choose which ones deserve our attention. Before we talk about how to shift those patterns, though, we need to draw a clearer boundary between two often confused concepts: overthinking and reflection. One keeps us stuck, the other helps us grow, and learning to tell them apart is one of the most important steps in reclaiming our mental clarity. It's easy to confuse overthinking with reflection. Both involve introspection. Both require mental energy. Both can occur in quiet moments, especially late at night when distractions fade and the mind turns inward. But despite their surface similarities, they are fundamentally different experiences. One is constructive, the other is circular. One moves you forward, the other keeps you in place. Reflection is thoughtful, purposeful, and anchored in curiosity. It allows you to step back from an experience and observe it with openness. You might ask, what can I learn from this? Or how did I really feel in that moment? Or what would I do differently next time? These questions invite insight. They guide you toward understanding. And most importantly, they end. Reflection has a beginning, a middle, and a conclusion. You think, you explore, and eventually you land somewhere, even if it's just a temporary resting point. Overthinking, on the other hand, rarely resolves anything. It doesn't seek insight so much as certainty. It goes in circles, asking the same questions in slightly different ways, searching for an answer that never quite satisfies. The questions sound similar. Why did I do that? Or what if I made the wrong choice? Or how do I know I didn't mess it up? But they carry an undercurrent of anxiety. They're not asked with the intention of learning. They're asked with the hope of erasing doubt. The difference lies in emotion and intention. Reflection feels spacious. It might involve discomfort, but it's a grounded discomfort, one that helps you process and integrate experience. Overthinking feels tight, urgent, and often panicked. It's not about exploring reality. It's about trying to control it, change it, or escape it. And because life is full of things we can't control or undo, overthinking gets stuck. It keeps running into the same wall, hoping the next thought will finally break through. Another way to tell the difference is by noticing how you feel afterward. After reflection, you usually feel clearer, even if the topic was difficult. There's a sense of resolution, or at least acceptance. After overthinking, you often feel more confused, more anxious, more mentally fatigued. The topic hasn't changed, but your relationship to it has become more entangled. Time also plays a role. Reflection has an internal clock. It doesn't drag endlessly because its goal is understanding, not perfection. Once a thought has been explored with enough depth, the mind naturally shifts. It says, okay, I've gotten what I needed from this. Overthinking lacks that clock. It's driven by a belief that there's always one more angle to consider, one more possibility to prepare for, one more error to prevent. It's also worth noting that reflection can often occur in conversation, with a friend, a journal, or even a therapist. Overthinking, in contrast, tends to isolate. It stays locked in your own head, looping quietly, convincing you that you're being productive when really, you're just stuck. The more time you spend there, the harder it becomes to tell whether your thoughts are helping or hurting. Knowing the difference between overthinking and reflection is more than an intellectual exercise. It's a skill, one that can be practiced. You can learn to pause and ask, am I thinking to understand or thinking to control? Am I exploring or am I spiraling? These moments of awareness don't stop the cycle immediately, but they offer a way out. They remind you that you have a choice. And that choice becomes especially important when we consider the impact of overthinking, not just on the mind, but on the heart and the nervous system. Because beyond the mental loop lies a deeper cost, one that shows up in how we feel, how we connect, and how we show up in the world. While overthinking begins in the mind, its effects ripple far beyond the boundaries of thought. It doesn't stay contained in the quiet space of internal dialogue. It seeps into your emotions, your relationships, and your daily experience of the world. What starts as a habit of mental looping gradually shapes how you feel, how you connect, and how others experience you in return. Emotionally, overthinking often creates a low-grade anxiety that never quite goes away. It's not always dramatic or obvious. It doesn't always show up as panic or distress. Instead, it lingers like static, an undercurrent of tension that hums just below the surface. You may find yourself feeling tired, even when you've done nothing physically demanding. You might feel restless without knowing why, or emotionally drained, despite having had no direct conflict. That's the hidden cost of cognitive overload. The brain is working overtime, and the body is keeping pace. This kind of mental overactivity also diminishes emotional resilience. When you're constantly processing and anticipating, your nervous system has less capacity to handle real-time stress. A small setback can feel overwhelming. A neutral comment can feel sharp. A minor delay can feel like failure. The mind, already stretched thin by its own inner dialogue, becomes hypersensitive to new inputs. Everything starts to feel personal. Everything feels like it requires a response. In relationships, overthinking can create distance where closeness is most needed. The more we analyze what others said or didn't say or didn't do, the more we begin responding to our interpretation of their behavior rather than the reality of it. We read between the lines, searching for hidden meanings, hidden motives, or potential signs of rejection. This often leads to over-explaining, second-guessing, or emotional withdrawal. Ironically, the desire to preserve connection can backfire. The more we overthink, the less present we are. We're not listening fully because we're mentally rehearsing our response. We're not enjoying time with someone because we're scanning their tone for signs of disapproval. The person in front of us becomes blurred by the projections in our head. Over time, this can erode intimacy. Relationships feel less like safe places and more like puzzles to decode. Overthinking also feeds self-consciousness. It creates an internal spotlight that's always aimed at you. Did I sound weird? Did I look awkward? Did they notice that? This hyper-awareness can be paralyzing. It makes social interaction feel like a performance, where every word and gesture is up for review. And when social energy is used not just to engage, but to mentally edit the past or prescript the future, exhaustion sets in fast. Beyond relationships, there's the broader emotional toll. Chronic overthinking is closely linked to depression, anxiety disorders, and insomnia. It disrupts the ability to feel at ease, to experience joy without caveats, to trust the moment as it is. Even rest becomes difficult, because rest requires letting go, and for an overactive mind, letting go feels risky. But perhaps the most painful consequence is this. Overthinking makes it hard to feel at home in your own mind. It turns your inner world into a courtroom, a debate stage, or an endless rehearsal room. And in doing so, it disconnects you from the simple experience of being alive right now without needing to explain, analyze, or prepare. Still, these consequences aren't inevitable. Once you see the cost clearly, you can begin to ask a different question, not just, how do I stop overthinking, but what am I protecting myself from, and is it worth the trade? That shift in awareness opens the door to new habits, new ways of responding, and eventually, new ways of relating to others, to the world, and most importantly, to yourself. But before we step into what healing looks like, we need to understand something else. The habits that unintentionally make overthinking worse. Because even with the best intentions, certain behaviors, often invisible in our routines, can quietly deepen the loop. Overthinking often feels like something that just happens. You're going about your day, and suddenly your mind is tangled in a loop. But what we often don't realize is that certain habits, small repeated actions woven into our daily lives, can quietly reinforce and prolong the cycle. These behaviors may seem harmless or even responsible on the surface, but over time, they become fuel for the fire of mental overactivity. One of the most common culprits is constant information consumption. We live in an age where there's always more to know, more to read, more to watch, more to compare. Scrolling through news feeds, self-help content, and opinions from strangers can create the illusion that we're becoming more informed or prepared. But in reality, it overloads the brain with unresolved narratives. When your mind is constantly digesting input, it has no space left to process or rest. The result is mental congestion. Too many open tabs, too many unfinished thoughts. Multitasking is another subtle trigger. While it may feel productive to juggle tasks and thoughts simultaneously, it fragments attention. And a fragmented mind struggles to complete thoughts. Instead of following a single idea to its natural end, the brain hops between tasks, each one partially addressed, none fully closed. That kind of mental fragmentation leaves a trail of unresolved threads, which later return as loops, thoughts demanding to be completed. Then there's social comparison, especially through social media. Even brief exposure to curated images and polished moments can lead the mind into a spiral. Am I doing enough? Am I behind? Should I be more like them? These questions may not be loud, but they burrow in. They generate subtle dissatisfaction that the mind then tries to solve, not through action, but through analysis. You start thinking about your choices, your timeline, your worth, but there's no answer that truly satisfies because the standard itself is imaginary. Over-planning and excessive journaling can also play a role. While planning and journaling are often seen as helpful practices, they can become forms of intellectual hoarding, where we collect thoughts rather than resolve them. Writing pages and pages of analysis may feel cathartic, but if it lacks structure or intention, it can just entrench the loops. Planning every detail of the future may feel like control, but in reality it may be avoidance, an effort to outthink uncertainty instead of learning to live with it. Even the habit of self-monitoring, constantly checking your thoughts, emotions, and body language, can reinforce the idea that something's always at risk. The more you scrutinize your inner world, the more you convince yourself that it's unstable. You begin treating your mind like a problem to be solved rather than a space to inhabit. The point isn't to demonize these habits. Many of them come from good intentions, the desire to improve, to understand, to stay informed. But without awareness, they feed the very cycle you may be trying to escape. The good news is that just as habits can deepen overthinking, they can also help unwind it. With small changes in awareness and routine, the mind can be guided back into clarity and presence. But before we discuss those techniques, let's consider a more subtle shift, learning to live with a mind that doesn't stop moving. Not fighting it, but learning to coexist with it. The truth about overthinking is this: you may never silence your mind entirely, and you don't need to. The goal isn't to become thoughtless, nor is it to battle your thoughts into submission. The goal is to change your relationship with thinking itself, to learn how to coexist with an overactive mind in a way that is less hostile, less reactive, and more grounded in awareness. One of the first steps in this shift is acknowledgement without judgment. Most people who overthink also criticize themselves for it. They get frustrated, ashamed, or embarrassed by how much mental energy they spend spiraling. But the more you judge your thoughts, the more entangled you become. You create a second layer of thinking, thoughts about your thoughts, which only amplifies the loop. Instead, what if you could notice a thought and simply say, there it is again, without needing to fix it or make it disappear? This non-reactive awareness is at the heart of many mindfulness practices. It teaches you that you are not your thoughts. You are the one observing them. That distinction, while subtle, is powerful. It turns the volume down. The thought might still be there, replaying a conversation, projecting into the future, but it no longer holds the same weight. You don't have to follow it. You don't have to answer it. You can let it pass like a cloud in the sky. Another part of coexistence is accepting the uncertainty that overthinking tries so hard to eliminate. The mind craves certainty. It wants to know that everything will work out, that nothing will go wrong, that every decision is the right one. But life doesn't offer those guarantees. Trying to think your way into absolute security is like trying to hold water in your hands. The tighter you grip, the more it slips away. When you begin to accept that uncertainty is not a threat, but a condition of life, the pressure to overthink starts to soften. It also helps to create intentional space for thought, rather than letting it flood you at random. This might mean setting aside 10 minutes to journal, or taking a quiet walk where you allow the mind to wander without distraction. Paradoxically, giving the mind a container, a time and place for mental processing, can help prevent it from spilling into every moment. Finally, it's important to cultivate compassion for your thinking self. The part of you that overthinks isn't trying to sabotage your peace. It's trying to help, even if it's doing so clumsily. It's trying to keep you safe, prepared, and emotionally intact. When you can appreciate its intention, you begin to relate to it less as an enemy and more as an overprotective ally, one that's doing its best with limited tools. You don't need to change who you are to find peace. You just need to shift how you relate to the mind you already have. And once you've made that shift, the next step becomes clearer. Learning specific techniques that don't just tame overthinking, but gently retrain your attention toward presence, clarity, and meaningful action. When it comes to managing overthinking, the goal is not to silence your thoughts entirely. The goal is to redirect your mental energy, to create space between a thought and your reaction to it, and to gradually train the mind to recognize when it's looping without clarity. The following techniques are not about quick fixes, but rather gentle shifts in practice that, when repeated consistently, help rewire the patterns that keep overthinking in motion. One of the most effective starting points is the technique of thought labeling. This practice comes from mindfulness-based therapies and involves simply naming what kind of thought you're having. Instead of getting pulled into the story, "What if I said the wrong thing?" you step back and label it worrying, or replaying, or judging. This small act of naming creates psychological distance. It reminds you that the thought is just a thought, not a command, not a truth, and not an emergency. Another helpful method is scheduled worry time. Overthinking often feels like it invades you at random, especially at bedtime. But what happens when you give it a home? Choose a specific time in the day, say 6:1 to 6:20 p.m., where you allow yourself to mentally process your worries, rehearse conversations, or think through scenarios. Outside of that window, if a worry arises, remind yourself, "I'll think about that during my worry time." At first, this may seem artificial, but over time, it trains the brain to contain and limit rumination to specific, manageable periods. Journaling, when done with structure, can also be powerful. Free writing can help unload mental clutter, but more importantly, focused journaling can help you analyze your thinking patterns. Try writing down your recurring thought, then asking, "Is this within my control? If yes, what action can I take? If no, what can I release?" This brings the thought out of abstraction and into conscious decision-making. It forces clarity onto a loop that otherwise runs unchecked. A cognitive tool called the why chain can also reveal the root of your overthinking. Take a persistent thought like, "I don't think they like me," and ask yourself, "Why does that matter to me?" Then ask why again to the next answer. Repeat this process 5 times. Often, what starts as a surface worry ends up revealing a deeper emotional fear like rejection, worthlessness, or abandonment. Once exposed, these core beliefs can be addressed more directly. Movement is another underrated intervention. The mind and body are not separate systems. When your thoughts are spiraling, your nervous system is often on high alert. Physical activity, walking, stretching, dancing, even deep breathing, can regulate your state. It sends a signal to the brain that you're safe, grounded, and not in danger. This reduces the physiological drive to think your way to safety. Mindfulness and meditation, when approached without pressure, are also useful. You don't need to clear your mind or find inner peace. Simply practicing being aware of your thoughts and returning to a point of focus, like your breath, the sounds around you, or the feeling of your feet on the ground, builds mental resilience. Each time your mind wanders and you gently bring it back, you are training your attention. Over time, that training creates space between the thought and the spiral. You can also practice externalization, which means speaking your thoughts out loud to someone else or even to yourself. Sometimes thoughts that seem overwhelming in the mind lose their intensity once spoken. They sound different outside the echo chamber of your head. This doesn't mean you need to share everything with others, but creating some form of external expression through voice, art, movement, or dialogue gives your thoughts a place to land. In daily life, boundary setting with information is key. Limit your exposure to constant stimulation, news cycles, opinion videos, advice columns, productivity hacks. Give your mind space to settle. Even silence can feel radical in a world that constantly demands attention. But that silence is not empty. It's where your mind can breathe. Finally, consider embracing philosophical perspectives like the Stoic idea of control, the belief that while you cannot control everything that happens, you can control your response. This orientation simplifies complex worries. You begin to sort your thoughts into 2 categories: what I can do something about and what I can't. This clarity often dissolves loops before they gain momentum. No single technique will end overthinking in one day. But these practices, used consistently and with patience, begin to retrain the mind. They offer you something overthinking never will, not more certainty but more freedom. And with that freedom comes the possibility of a different kind of relationship with your mind, one built not on fear but on respect, not on control but on choice. As we reach the end of this journey, there's one final reflection to make about what it truly means to think too much, and how understanding that pattern might just be the start of something gentler and more awake. We've now traced the shape of overthinking from every angle, its definitions, its roots, its neurological structure, its emotional impact, and the ways it quietly inserts itself into our daily lives. And if there's one truth that echoes through it all, it's this: overthinking is not a sign of failure, it's a signal. A signal that the mind is trying to make sense of a world that often refuses to make sense. Many people go through life believing that if they could just think a little more, plan a little harder, or get the perfect answer, they could finally relax. But the irony is that peace rarely comes from more thought. It comes from recognizing that not every thought deserves your full attention. It comes from choosing which mental roads are worth traveling and which are simply familiar loops. There's a certain humility required to accept that you will never fully outthink life, that no amount of analysis will erase uncertainty or vulnerability or change. But that humility is freeing. It allows you to step back from the exhausting job of trying to predict or prevent everything, and instead to live in deeper alignment with the present moment, with what is, rather than what might be. When you begin to shift your relationship with thinking, something else happens too. You begin to trust yourself more, not because you have all the answers, but because you've learned to hold the questions without panic. You've learned to notice the spiral without being consumed by it. You've learned to be with your mind, even when it's messy or loud, and say, "I see you, but I'm still here." That, perhaps, is the real art of thinking too much. Not in eliminating thought or escaping it, but in meeting it with clarity, patience, and grace. In using thought as a tool, not as a tyrant. In reclaiming the spaciousness that exists beyond the loops. And maybe as you lie awake tonight and your mind begins to stir, thinking about the day or the future, or that one conversation, you'll remember this: your thoughts are not dangerous. You don't have to believe everyone. You don't have to wrestle with them or obey them or fear them. You can let them pass. You can breathe. You can rest, not because your mind is silent, but because you are no longer at war with it. So the next time your thoughts come rushing in, remember, it's not a flaw, it's a function. It's your mind doing what it was built to do. But you now are learning how to respond, not with panic, but with presence. And that's the beginning of a new kind of quiet. One that doesn't demand silence, but welcomes peace.